Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to the 2023 Coase Lecture. From its origins, the University of Chicago Law School, as a professional school within a research university, has been committed to interdisciplinary scholarship. And as you know, our faculty seek to draw on knowledge and methods from other disciplines in order to expand our understanding of law and legal institutions. Now, often these interdisciplinary ideas create whole new paradigms for our understanding of law and legal institutions. And often this scholarship challenges conventional established wisdom within law. And one of the most powerful examples of this has been economic analysis of law, or law and economics. Law and economics has influenced our understanding of nearly every field of law. And within certain fields, it is now the primary methodology for understanding law. And this happened all very quickly. In little more than a generation, law and economics became a standard feature of legal education throughout the United States. And it was born right here at the University of Chicago. Ronald Coase, who was the Clifton R. Musser Professor of Law and Economics, was one of the most important contributors to it. He powerfully deployed the ideas of economics to help us understand law and legal institutions. Now, I'm sure that all of our students here are familiar with the famous Coase theorem, which was contained in his highly influential article, The Problem of Social Cost. I will not cold call on anyone right now to recite it. Professor Coase also made important contributions to our understanding of the spectrum by the Federal Communications Commission, durable goods monopolies, the private provision of public goods, and importantly, the theory of the firm. Indeed, Professor Coase was the founder of what we now call transactions costs economics. In 1991, he received the Nobel Prize in Economics, and he was the first faculty member in a law school to receive a Nobel Prize. I believe that still remains true. In 1992, this lecture was founded to honor him and to ensure that the type of path-breaking interdisciplinary scholarship that he began in law and economics continues to flourish at our law school. The purpose of the lecture is to share ideas from law and economics with our students, particularly, but not exclusively, our first-year students. And there will be time for questions, so I encourage you to think of them as our lecture proceeds. And it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker, Adam Chilton. Adam Chilton is Professor of Law and the Walter Mander Research Scholar. Professor Chilton is a scholar of tremendous range and interest. He's written on a wide range of topics, from international law and trade and comparative law to judicial decision-making, the legal profession, even the legal academy itself. And true to the highest ambitions of interdisciplinary scholarship, Professor Chilton's work has expanded our understanding on all of these topics. He has addressed questions such as, does the enshrinement of rights in constitutions actually protect human rights? What is the relationship between antitrust law and international trade? Do law clerks influence the decision-making of Supreme Court justices? And even, how can the grading of law school exams be improved? His current projects include the development and enforcement of competition law and regimes around the world, bilateral labor agreements and whether they promote international labor migration, and efforts to improve the quality of life in India's slums. Professor Chilton's book with Mila Versteeg, How Constitutional Rights Matter, which appeared in 2020, has received numerous awards as the best book in the field and has been the subject of 2 academic conferences. As many of our students here today know, Professor Chilton is an outstanding teacher as well. He has taught international law and trade, immigration law, canonical ideas in legal thought, and, I think as many of you know, tort law. In all these subjects, students praise his intellectual challenge and the insight of his teaching. So it's very fitting that today, so interdisciplinary a scholar is our speaker on law, economics, and international development. Please welcome our 2023 Coase lecturer, Professor Adam Chilton.
Everyone, thanks for being here today. So as Dean Miles mentioned, I work on a wide variety of topics, mostly in comparative and international law, that I think is firmly part of law and economics, and is specifically applied microeconomics. Now, when I got to college and my first year of college took introductory to microeconomics, I hated it. It was a lot of supply and demand curves about minimum wages, and it didn't seem important to me at all. But after that, I spent as much time as I could over the next 6 or 7 years with a backpack, traveling around to the world to as many countries as I could go to, specifically in the developing world, to try to see what was going on. When I finally got to law school and grad school, law and economics was the field where suddenly it seemed like people had answers to these questions to diagnose the problems that were causing some of the world's biggest social problems, and prescriptions and solutions to start help addressing those. Now, these simple ideas in law and economics then have powerful and profound impacts for how we can think about things like international development. Now, in this talk, I want to talk about 4 of those ideas. Now, what are these 4 ideas? Here's a stylized version of them, of standard principles in law and economics. One is the importance of efficiency, that is to prioritize growth as a value within our legal framework. 2 is on redistribution, to deprioritize redistribution within thinking about the functioning of legal rules. 3 is an emphasis on private law over public law. And then 4 is belief in the benefits and comparative advantages of markets. Now, as Dean Miles also said, I teach torts, and I'm always eager to teach torts because it's an opportunity to talk to about these ideas to students right when they get to law school. Now, in my experience, these were profoundly changing ideas, but when I tell them to students today, often I get this reaction of thinking, caring about growth, not caring about redistribution, you sound like a bit of a monster, and it seems like maybe what you care about is, corporations getting rich, not real problems that real people have. Now, I'm always at a disconnect because this seems like the guidebook to thinking about solving these problems, and so I'm always confused why we're at a disconnect. And I think the answer to this, in part at least, is that you're all too rich. Now, I know what you're thinking. I'm paying, whatever it is, 75 grand a year to be here. I'm making negative money. How could I be too rich? Your ideas are just bad, right? But here's what I mean. So imagine for a second that this little icon represents $1 trillion, right? So $1 trillion. Now, the total world economic output in a given year is $96.5 trillion as of 2021, right? So that's everything in the world that we produce adds up to $96 trillion. Now, in America, in the United States, this is one of the most staggering facts in economics. The United States produces 23.3 trillion of that. That is 24%, nearly a quarter of the world's economic output is produced here in the United States. Now, here's why that should just be a mind-blowing fact. Now, here's 100 million people. In the entire world, there's 7.9 billion people. Here in the United States, 330 million people. In other words, just 4% of the world's population. So you put these 2 facts together, and it's the case that 4% of the world's population produces nearly a quarter of the economic output of the world. We are truly staggeringly rich in the United States by any metric. Now, even now you might be thinking, all right, we're rich in the United States overall for our total economic output, but that's all going to Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and other financiers. That doesn't mean that everybody's rich. And also, things are expensive here and taxes are high, so this isn't painting an accurate picture of what's going on. True, those are all true that there is income inequality in the United States. There are some people that make staggering amounts of money, taxes may be high, and it's also the case that living expenses are too. But even if you forget about those things, we're still staggeringly wealthy. So for instance, the global median income per year is about $2,500. Now this is adjusted for purchasing power parity, so that's what's so-called international dollars. So this is what the median global income for the world is. The US poverty line for a single person is about $13,000 right now. So that is, in total, 4.6, nearly 5 times higher than what it is to be a median person in the world. And in fact, being at the US poverty line means that you make in the 84th percentile for the entire world. Right? So you were wealthier if you were poor in the United States than more than 3/4 of the planet. Now, beyond that, we say just the median US worker that actually works, because not everyone in the United States works. Some people are in school, some people are retired, other people are disabled, whatever it may be, right? If you take the set of median people that work post-tax dollars, you're at about $40,000 a year in post-tax dollars for the median person that works in the United States. That's 14 times what the global median is. And on top of that, you're richer than 97% of the world if you just have a job in the United States on average, right? Now, that's still less than you would make as a summer associate in a given year in a 10-week summer. Now, on top of that, setting aside global being a summer associate, I previously mentioned that there are 7.9 billion people in the world. The median starting salary after you leave this building, you will be richer than 7,821,000,000 of them, right? Just your starting salary. And this is a massive underestimate because the world income distribution data taps out at the 90th ninth percentile. So I'm positive you're above the 90th ninth percentile. Where you fall in that, we don't know because we don't have enough data. All right, so we here in the United States and in the legal profession are extremely rich, but most of the world still isn't. Now, here's the distribution of global income per day, right? So first important fact here, the 50th percentile, where that black line there crosses 50th percent, global median averages out per day to about $6.70. So that's what most people are making. United States, again, global median, so this is not people that work, this is everybody, you're at $57 a day. And international poverty lines in the OECD and developed countries like the United States, those are set at $30 a day. Now, importantly, this goes back to some of the earlier facts we were saying, at this poverty line, it's still the case that 85% of the world's population is below this poverty line, right? Below the poverty line that we set in developed countries, even when adjusting for purchasing power parity. Now, what that's telling you is most of the planet adjusting for cost of living is still poor by the standards that we set for ourselves. Development economist at Harvard, Lance Pritchett, says that when we talk about poverty, we should always think in terms of the golden rule, which is, what is the bare minimum that we'd be willing to accept for ourselves? And that answer is something like our own poverty line. And so until we get everybody on the planet to something like the poverty line that we're willing to set in industrialized countries, we simply have too much poverty, right? This is the kind of target that we should be thinking about, is how to set that up. Now, if you think in terms of those 7.9 billion people I mentioned before, that means 6.7 billion of them are below that mark. This problem of thinking about those 6.7 billion people being far below the poverty line that we would set for ourselves, and finding ways to increase the economic growth to raise them out of poverty, I think is the most important question. This is the most pressing policy issue that we have, and thinking of ways that we can help tackle this problem is the policy question of our time. Now, this is where law and economics comes in. I previously mentioned 4 ideas that I wanted to talk about in this lecture. That is efficiency, redistribution, the benefits of private law, and the benefits of markets. And each one of these, I think, is extremely helpful for thinking about exactly this problem. That is, for thinking about how we can start tackling this problem of getting those 85% of the world's population, that 6.7 billion people, up to the standard of living that is the bare minimum that we'd be willing to accept for ourselves. So what are these ideas and what are they? Now, first, efficiency. Now, within law and economics, efficiency is often spoken about as a descriptive hypothesis and a normative hypothesis. Now, the descriptive hypothesis is typically attributed to Richard Posner. So what Dick Posner said is that on average, the common law evolves towards efficiency. For those of you that have taken my torts class, this is the first thing we talk about on the first day, right? It was this descriptive claim that in general, this is what's happened, right? So over time, judges have experimented with different legal rules and different legal standards, and that over time, those have gotten more and more efficient, right? And that by efficient, we mean that it produces the rule that has the greatest economic output. Right? So we choose between strict liability and negligence based on whether or not we think it's going to have a more efficient outcome. Now, in addition to that descriptive hypothesis that Richard Posner's made, there's also a normative version of that claim. The normative version of that claim is to say, it's not just descriptively this has occurred, or descriptively this continues to occur, occur within our judiciary, but that this is a good thing, and that the criteria that judges should be thinking about, as they descriptively do, is what will produce the most efficient outcomes when setting their normative rules. In other words, if you were asking yourself when confronted with a contracts case, or property case, or a torts case, what rule to pick, that the answer is the one that overall generates the most efficiency, which in turn should generate the most growth. Now, and part of that is that I think that the generation of law and economics scholars like Richard Posner or Frank Easterbrook or Ronald Coase, as we've already discussed, recognized that generating growth has incredible importance. Now, in fact, Richard Posner, in some writings, made an extremely strong version of this claim. So this is in an article called The Ethical and Political Basis of the Efficiency Norm. Richard Posner said, a society which aims at maximizing wealth, unlike a society which aims at maximizing utility, that is happiness, will produce an ethically attractive combination of happiness, of rights, that is life and liberty, and of sharing with the less fortunate members of society. So this is a strong descriptive and normative claim where he's saying not only descriptively the common law judges on average pick rules that are efficient, and not only is it good that common law judges pick legal rules that on average are efficient, but the stronger claim to say that as a society, if we just focus on efficiency and focus on growth, instead of worrying about other priorities, that's how we'll get things right. Right? So this is a strong version of the efficiency claim. Now, the data here suggests even this seems radical, seems harsh, seems like you're prioritizing the wrong things perhaps. If you look at the data, this is just undeniably true. So let me say a little bit about that. So first, until now I've been talking about income at the individual level. So what is global income at the median person or the median person in the US, $6 a day, $30 a day, etc. So I want to switch now and talk about GDP per capita. So GDP per capita is just another measure of individual wealth where we take all of the economic output for a given country and divide it by the number of people. Now, GDP per capita is slightly different than income in a few ways. Notably, for instance, it includes government spending, so the numbers won't line up perfectly right. However, if you plot societies by GDP per capita, which is the x-axis here, and then by median income, which is what we've been talking about too now, on the y-axis, you see that these are extremely strongly correlated, right? So the answer is you have a richer country, you have richer people, right? Which should be unsurprising, even though there can be some variation based on tax and spending policies, et cetera, within these relationships. Now, I previously mentioned we're just all too rich to understand some of these problems. Here's where the United States falls on this graph. You have to sort of actually adjust the x-axis, if you notice at the bottom, so the US can still fit, right? To show how rich we are compared to that. It's only Switzerland up there with some industrialized countries on this axis. All right, now, within GDP per capita, this measure ends up correlating extremely strongly with whatever you think you might care about. So here's one aggregate measure, which is the UN Development Index. Now, the UN Development Index has a range of problems with it. It's been criticized for the indicators that it includes, the way that it logs income. A number of different complaints have been lodged against it. And it was in fact created to try to take the emphasis off of just looking at GDP per capita. So people came along and said, no, things other than just money matters. We're going to create a different index. Now, that different index that they created correlates basically perfectly with GDP per capita. In other words, you might think that we care about not just how rich people are, but how long they live, or how likely they are to go to school, or what their various rights are. But those things end up being predicted by how rich they are, right? With huge amounts of accuracy. But beyond that, we can look at individual metrics that are part of these concerns we might have. So for instance, Posner made the claim that people will be happier in societies that focus on wealth maximization. Self-reported life satisfaction is higher in wealthier countries, which should be unsurprising, right? That is, if you have more money and less scarcity, you are happier on average than if you don't. Now, of course, there's some variation. It's not a perfect one-to-one correlation. But in general, it's a true pattern. Life expectancy, hunger, child mortality, years of schooling, literacy rates, whatever data that you can find on outcomes that you might care about, end up correlating highly with growth. And so as Posner said, if you get the growth right, if you get your economy big, it's tough to go wrong on anything else. But if you don't get the growth right, if you don't grow the size of your economy, it is very easy to go wrong on everything else. And we can see example after example of countries around this world. In other words, the strongest version of the efficiency hypothesis that you can see Posner making looks basically right in the global data. And in fact, this is ends up being the approach that is now common in development economics, even though Posner wrote that something like 30 years ago, made that claim, and we didn't have access to all of the data sources and all of the knowledges. It's today the case that development economists will say things like there's one path to prosperity, and it's broad-based growth. Right? And so the strong version of the efficiency claim is basically right. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a second, but before I do, I want to talk a little bit about redistribution. Now, this is perhaps one of the claims about law and economics that I think is jarring at first to hear. That is a de-emphasis within setting legal rules on redistribution when we're trying to figure out what the right legal rule is. Now, when we talk about it in torts or contracts or property, here's what we typically mean. We mean something like, when we're trying to figure out whether or not the defendant should pay the plaintiff, what we shouldn't be thinking about is whether or not the defendant is richer than the plaintiff, or whether or not the plaintiff needs the money, or whether or not they have a higher marginal utility that they get from spending that money because they have medical bills or expenses or whatever else. And instead, we should set the right legal rule, and then later, if we think that the plaintiff within the case needs bills taken care of, expenses paid for, et cetera, we should do it through the tax and transfer system, right? That is, we can have higher marginal tax rates on the wealthy, and then we can spend through social spending programs and redistribute, whether or not it's the earned income tax credit or social security payments, food stamps, subsidized education, whatever it is that we think is the right systems of redistribution, right? But the importance, the idea that when setting the legal rules, to not prioritize redistribution as a value when figuring out what the right legal rule is. Now, some variants of, just like with the efficiency hypothesis, at times within the law and economics movement, there was people who adhered to either stronger versions of this claim. So for instance, Aaron Director, who gets a huge amount of credit for growing the law and economics movement from working in this school and being a mentor to generations of Coase and Posner and Easterbrook, et cetera, and although it's received perhaps slightly less attention. What he said in some of his writing on this idea back in the Journal of Law and Economics in 1964 is that the common man or average family should have a far greater stake in the size of our aggregate income than in any possible redistribution of income. In other words, what you should care about as a regular person is how big the economy is, not what the redistribution plan is. Now, a version of this, then by George Stigler, the economist, turned this into Director's Law in an article to say that Director's Law, by paraphrasing some of what Aaron Director had said, is that public expenditures are made for the primary benefits of the middle classes and financed with taxes which are borne in considerable part by the poor and by the rich. In other words, what Director's Law turned into is a claim, a political claim, that although that we might envision a system of redistribution that was perfectly aligned to improve the lives of the poor, in practice, due to the realities of politics, that's not going to be what occurs. So not only is he saying that the average person should care much more about how fast the economy is growing and how big that it gets, but that realistically, politically, we're not going to redistribute away that ends up benefiting the poor. Now, again, like with the strong version of Dick Posner's claim about efficiency, the strong version of Aaron Director's claim around the world, since he wrote this in 1964, 60 years ago, before we had the data to check it, seems also exactly right. So let me show you this. So this is from Lant Pritchett, the economist at Harvard I mentioned previously. What this is showing you is median annual income on the x-axis and poverty rate within a country on the y-axis. And what these different lines are different level of poverty rates. And so the axis furthest to the left is at $1.90 a day. Then you have it $2.50 a day, and then $5.50 a day. Okay, so how many people in your country are living at $5.50 a day? Now, the correlation in that final line, which the number of people living at $5.50 a day in income, is 99.4. 99.4 of the variation in poverty in a country is explained by the median income. That's everything, right? All of the variation of how many poor people you have in a country is explained by how rich your country is on average using current data. In other words, there is no country in any meaningful way that has figured out a way to redistribute out of their level of poverty. If you take a country at some given level of GDP per capita, $3,000, $5,000, $7,000, No one has figured out how to jump the line in alleviating poverty through their government programs. The only way that people figure out how to do it is to grow the economy. Right? So this broad claim that in practice that we're not going to use redistribution to alleviate poor has been basically right. Now, it's not just that it hasn't happened, it's that it couldn't solve the problem that we started with. So what do I mean by this? Now, back to our graph before on GDP per capita and median income. Now, the threshold that people set frequently when I mentioned before about what is the international poverty line, people will either say that the global rich country poverty line is $30,000 a day or $25,000 GDP per capita. Now, the country that is the closest to both of those metrics in 2021 data at a GDP per capita of $24,900 is Chile. Right? So Chile is the wealthiest country in all of South America. It is doing quite well along a number of dimensions. However, in 2019, they had civil unrest within the country that led to the drafting of a new constitutional process because people were frustrated with their stagnant incomes and inability to pay their bills. Right? In other words, the way to think about this is that even at the level of Chile, which is at the very cusp of the line that we're talking about, of where you can no longer consider yourself a country that needs to grow, they're still having riots in the streets over an extended period about not having enough money. Right? Now, importantly, in this box, though, of the people that are at less than $30 a day or in less than $25,000 in GDP per capita, that's where, as I said before, about 6.7 billion people live, right, in this box. Right? This is China, India, all of Africa, right, is part of this. So we still have people living below this line, below the Chile threshold. Right? So one way to think about it, in just GDP per capita, we take all of those countries, we figure out how much GDP per capita they would need to get themselves to 25,000, add up that number. The number that we end up getting to is 91 million, right? So that's 91 trillion. Yes, we're way off, 2 orders of magnitude from there. 91 trillion. So we're basically the entire world's economic output. We need to nearly double it if you use this measure. Right? Now, that's still not going to be entirely correct because there are people in countries above that line that are still living below $30 a day. There's some in the United States, in fact. So that's not going to get you perfectly there. And that includes government expenditures. So what if we back it out and we go back to the graph that we said before, which actually graphs people based on their income per day and start thinking about how far off we are if we just redistribute it. Now, the answer is, if we were to take all of the people that are living at above $30 a day and redistribute their money perfectly, right? We are still short of this poverty line. You need more than 2x. In other words, even if we could go to every big law partner, every banker, every tech entrepreneur and say, you only get to make $30 a day and we're going to perfectly redistribute this, we do not have enough money in the world. There is not enough economic output to get us to the poverty line. In other words, redistribution as a solution cannot solve our problem under the status quo. And beyond that, redistributing in that kind of aggressive way, beyond being theoretically and politically completely impossible, there's no way that's going to happen, right? Is not desirable because redistributing in that way would massively harm growth, right? And that growth is generated when people have enough savings to invest and then generate new projects. So it's not possible that we could do this either. So the idea that we could just perfectly double our economy and still be able to get rid of poverty isn't possible. In other words, you need to do a lot more than double the size of the world's economic output if we want to lift everybody up. The conservative estimates on this are that the world's economy needs to grow by over 7 times. So we need to grow the world's economy by about 7 times to get to the point where everyone hits that threshold of getting to that $30 a day. Right? Now, what would it take to do this? This is going back to the efficiency point, which remember, when we talked about efficiency, we said part of the insight there is that growth is so important and efficiency is so important that you shouldn't just be giving away growth whenever you have is a possibility. So thinking about that, how long would it take us to get to this 7.2x larger world economy? If we could hit 5% growth, that's 40 years. So that's in at least my lifetime, certainly in yours, that we could theoretically hit this, right? Now, 5% growth has been possible in countries in the developing world. It isn't really realistic in the developed world. And as countries grow larger and larger and get closer to that $25,000 per year, it's extremely unlikely that we're going to be able to hit a 5% growth average. 3% is even higher than the United States average growth, or many countries in Europe are much lower than this. But at 3%, we could get there at 66 years. You go down to 2% growth, that's 99 years, nearly 100 years, that we can get to the point where we grow our economy by this percent. But if you go to 1%, it's 200 years. We're in the year 2222 would be the year that we'd hit the $690 trillion necessary to get everyone out of poverty. Now, what you see here, though, is just 1% or a 0.5% difference in growth rates have profound effects for how many generations of people you're condemning to live in poverty. Right? In other words, the solution to this problem isn't to think that we can just redistribute our way out of it without growing our way out of it too. Now, one last note on this. This isn't to say that in the United States and in many other countries that we shouldn't be doing more redistribution and that we're not doing enough and that we can do a better job and that we could reduce poverty within this country. That is obviously should be more of a priority in the United States and other countries too. But what it's trying to say is it's not the only solution to the problem, or it can't solve all of the problem. We need more than that. We need growth too. All right, third idea. The third idea is the emphasis on private law. Now, what do I mean here? So many of the primary contributions of the great law and economic scholars, the Posners and Easterbrooks and Fischels and Directors and Coases, and have been in the fields of private law. They wrote about contracts and torts and property, and a lot less about constitutions or constitutional rights or other aspects of public law. Now, why is that? The reason I think is that they recognized that what really matters to figuring out how to improve economic growth and to improve welfare is figuring out getting property rights correct and then enforcing contracts such that people can have exchange. Set up companies, you have those companies well run, you enforce the contracts that they sign, and things go pretty well. Right? Where, with public law, in so many instances, there's no clear correlation between public law choices that we make and outcomes that you might care about. Now, I think this is one of the aspects that can be jarring as a law student, in that many people will come in and say, I want to work on things that matter, I care about the Supreme Court. And then the law and economics people in the room sort of laugh at you, because that stuff, other than a few social rights cases, doesn't matter, right? It doesn't really show up in our growth statistics or in other measures, whereas getting private law right, getting contracts rights right, really does make a difference. Now, I had trouble finding any pithy quote of any famous law and economics person articulating this idea. Instead, what I found is someone writing about the evolution, the 25th anniversary of private law theory, saying that the genesis of thinking about private law starts with Coase's theory of social cost, right? So Peter Kane saying the genesis of private law theory is a discrete area of academic study might be traced to the publication of Ronald Coase's famous article, The Problem of Social Cost. So in other words, at this point is when people start saying we should be focusing on these areas like firms, companies, contracts, et cetera, to try to focus on growth. Now, in my own research, and Dean Miles alluded to some of this, a lot of what I've focused on is trying to figure out what we might be able to do with differences in constitutions to try to see if we can make a difference on human rights or on economic growth or other outcomes you might care about. Unfortunately, the results there, when you start looking for benefits from public law sources, are extremely underwhelming. So let me point out just a few of these examples from my own work. So here's the growth in the number of constitutional rights around the world. So from the end of World War II until 2015, it's basically doubled. So the average country went from having something like 20 rights in their constitution to having 40 rights in their constitution. Right? So countries have added in right to healthcare, right to education, right to gender equality, right to the environment, et cetera, into their constitution. Now, in the same time that's happened, the protection of human rights around the world has increased as well. So this is a composite indicator that's supposed to measure general human rights that was created by a political scientist named Christopher Ferris, which has shown that things have gotten better around the world. There's more rights for women, for sexual and gender minorities, for children, et cetera. It's not perfect. There are many countries that have a long way to go, but it is definitely better than it was in 1945. Right? Now, here's the kicker. These things are negatively correlated. So the countries with more rights do worse on the human rights protection scores, right? Having more rights in your constitutions does not seem to have any influence on how well you actually do at protecting those rights, right? Now, I could go on for a long time about different versions of this correlation, but I'll just mention one more. Here's having more rights in GDP per capita. They also negatively correlate, right? Now, part of what's happened here is that countries have figured out that we as voters and as citizens are suckers, right? Which is, if you don't want to reform and you don't want to make their lives better, you put what they ask for in the Constitution because you know it will not help them, right? And so you can get away with expanding rights, signing treaties, promising to respect human rights without having to materially change people's status of living. Now, the lesson here from law and economics is to not be suckered into this, right? To not start thinking that what's in the Constitution is necessarily going to make a difference for the way that people actually experience their lives, because these things don't correlate in the way that you'd like. One last example of this from my most recent research on the subject that came out in the Journal of Legal Studies here, on women's rights specifically. Now, women's rights is an issue where we have pretty good measures of women's rights around the world because we can take indicators that are measured separately for men and women, like life expectancy or appearing in school or literacy rates or infant mortality, and compare the two. And through those comparisons generate an index of how well women are doing in different countries, right? So in other words, we have the bare bones indicators to tell us what's going on. So on the left here, what you see is the number of constitutions that respect rights to gender equality. And what you see on the right is what's called the Historical Gender Equality Index, which is just the relationship between how well men and women are doing on various indicators. What you see there is things, again, have slowly gotten better for women over time in the second half of the 20th century. But this is before and after countries adopt those constitutional rights to gender equality. Nothing changes, right? And this is just one graph showing you that. But you can look at this different ways or cut the data however you like. What you see is countries get richer and women do better, right? Countries promise that women will do better, nothing changes, right? The promise is irrelevant when it's written into the Constitution or signing a treaty like CEDAW, but the growth actually makes a difference. All right, fourth point. Fourth point about the belief in markets. Now, here Frank Easterbrook, I think, said this best when he said, markets are costly and imperfect, but they beat the political process every time. Now, what the caricature of law and economics is sometimes turned into is that law and economics movements thinks that markets are perfect, or that markets always get it right, or that markets solve every problem. That is false, right? The people that study markets, that study antitrust or corporations or competition, are the ones that know full well all of the ways that markets can go wrong and that they need to be regulated, right? Which is why so many of the people that we've been mentioning spend time thinking about the regulation of markets and how to improve it. Right? So the belief is not that markets are imperfect or infallible or always get it right. That's not the claim. The claim is a comparative one that markets do relatively well in improving outcomes relative to just pure political processes. Now, in general, if you were to look at the countries that have had success eliminating poverty, raising their income over time, the common denominator is not whether or not they have a president or a parliament, a common law or a civil law system, a dictatorship or a democracy. The common denominator when growth starts changing is when there's more emphasis put on free markets. You can look at this from China in the late 70s to India in the early 90s. When growth kicks off is when market reforms happen, right? So we don't have a solution to this problem. No one's figured it out, a political solution that doesn't involve markets to try to solve it. Now, what do we do from here, though? Where can we go if you think, as I do, that the most important problem, the thing that you should care the most about, is figuring out how to take that 85% of the world's population and get them up to the bare minimum level of poverty that we'd be willing to tolerate in our own country? We think of that as the problem. What can more markets tell us? Well, I'm going to mention just three, but there's many more things that you could think about or care about. First, trade. So trade between countries, international trade, has been a process that has had huge benefits since the end of World War II and the start of the GATT period. Now, for instance, the standard estimate is that in developing countries, which is setting aside the industrial countries like the United States or Germany, that 15 to 20% growth is attributable just to free trade. Right? So increasing trade has been one of the levers that has driven this. And for instance, in the paper cite from this, the authors conclude by saying, we challenge anyone to think of anything that has done as much as generating 15 to 20% growth in the developed world as trade. Now, whatever the answer is, I don't know it, right? So this is the area where making markets liberalized so people can sell their goods to richer people is the main driver we have. And if you look at from South Korea to Taiwan to Vietnam to China, it's the ability to sell your goods on the global scale that generates that growth that lifts people out of poverty. This is a belief in markets there. Now, here's the problem. So many of the benefits from trade, the possible upside, we've already realized, right? And the reason is that we've already radically liberalized most forms of international trade. There's still room to liberalize in many industries or trade and services as well. So it's not as if there is not more progress that could be made, but the low-hanging fruit here is gone, right? And so through the GATT process and the WTO process, we have done a lot of the work to already realize these benefits. All right, next, urbanization. Within urbanization, the idea here is that people are radically more productive in cities. People in cities are able to earn more money. They're able to perform their skills for more people. You can think about this in just in our own lives, whether or not it's lawyers or artists or plumbers, whatever it is, you're more efficient when you're around a lot of other people. Beyond that, your environmental impact is radically lower as well, and so there's numerous benefits to getting people to cities. Now, notably, one thing that development economists will often study is rural-urban wage gaps. Now, rural-urban wage gap is the difference adjusting for cost of living, because clearly it's more expensive to live in a city, that you earn from being in a city, right? Now, in China, it's something like 9%. In Indonesia, it's about 10%. In India, for instance, if you're living in rural India versus living in Mumbai or Hyderabad or Bangalore, it's nearly 50% more that you could make if you were just able to get to that city. Now, India, for instance, is soon to be the largest country in the world with 1.3 billion people. Of the 700 million people in the world in extreme poverty, that's less than $1.90 a day, this is truly dire poverty, the largest single place where they're located is in rural India. And so the one lever we really have to try to address this is to try to figure out ways to make it easier for people to move to cities, right? Now, what makes it easier for people to move to cities? Build houses, and take a variety of other steps that make it easy for growth to happen within those cities instead of choking off the growth in cities, right? Which is what we're seeing far too much in the United States and other countries around the world, efforts to reduce the ability of people to easily move to cities where they can be more productive. So urbanization is one of the other big levers we have. Finally, though, migration. Now, migration, and by this I mean people moving between countries, this is the massive lever that we have. Economist Michael Clemens calls this the $1 trillion bill sitting on the sidewalk, but even that radically understates it. So for instance, the latest research suggests that if you take the same person that's living in Central America and move them to the United States, doing the same job, adjusting for differences in cost of living, differences in taxes, et cetera, that you'd make, nearly $14,000 per year controlling for everything, right? So you take someone in Central America, you move them to Los Angeles, and they are immediately above that poverty line, right? That's all it would take for so many people in Central America. Now, beyond this, though, it's not just that we can move people from Central America to the United States. The potential of moving people and the benefits of migration on economic growth are something like 40 times higher than the next best solutions that people have found, right? It's radically easier to take someone in a poor place and move them to a rich place than to improve the poor place, right? Now, in fact, the low-end estimates that we have, to go back to before I mentioned that the world economy is 96.5 trillion, the low-end potential benefits of easing migration that people estimate are about 50% of that, right? So you get a 50% increase as the low-end estimate. Some of the higher-end estimates are a 150% increase, right? 150% increase that we could have in global GDP by just making it easier for people to live and to work where they want, right? No other legal reforms necessary other than just making it so that people can apply their same skills in a place where that's valued more and they'd be more productive as a result. All right, now, I want to end with 3 caveats before I conclude. First, the looming thing in the background behind everything that I've said is that what I've been talking about is thinking about how we could radically grow our economy to try to leave people out of poverty. There is no way to do that without energy. No one has figured out a way to decouple economic growth from energy consumption. Economic growth goes up, so does energy use. Now, given that we have a warming planet and that climate change is a massive threat, the question then is, can we figure out a way to get 85% of the world's population using more electricity without it being all carbon-based? So that's a key problem that we need to solve from this to work. Now, there's estimates suggesting that the costs of actually moving to entirely renewables may be negative. That is, that we actually might net save money by making the transition, but we have to figure that out too to be able to even think about solving this problem. That's point one. Point two. What I've been saying here is to overgeneralize from some principles from law and economics, and to say that here's views about efficiency or redistribution or growth that we could use to start thinking about the problem of global development or international poverty. What's important to emphasize, though, is the rules, the specific legal rules that work in one place, don't necessarily work in another. And one area where there's been disastrous track records is where people like me that teach these topics in the US travel to other countries and start thinking that they know how things work and that you can start saying, here's how you should restructure your economy or restructure your legal system or restructure your laws. It turns out that even though some of these general principles, believing in the importance of growth, the respect for property rights and contracts, et cetera, on average are useful, the details and the specifics we don't always get right. Now, final point. What I've been talking about so far is something like trying to think about what might be an important priority, that is international economic growth, and what law and economics can tell us about that. But what I haven't said anything about is how to get the politics right to make this happen, right? How to make changes to prioritize growth, to try to help solving this problem. And that's something where law and economics doesn't have good answers, and economists frequently get it wrong, right? So economists' views on what might be politically palatable or likely to work often don't. And so instead, we need to be thinking about this in a broad-based way to try to find growth-oriented solutions that are actually palatable in a way that people can get behind and believe. All right, I'm going to stop there, and I think we have time for some questions. Yes, sure. All right, so I have two reactions to that. So the first is the way that I'm, putting an emphasis on things like talking about property rights, contracts, et cetera, as solutions for growth, is definitely missing a lot of the nuance in thinking about development economics and also contemporary thinking in development economics. But I think some aspects of contemporary thinking in development economics have lost the thread. So not what you're saying, which I'll come back to in a second, which is there's been this big, massive move within development economics to people focusing on running randomized controlled trials. And what people do is they go to Kenya or India and they start giving out mosquito nets or school books or various other resources that are relatively cheap, and then they measure the benefits. And that's been what so much of a development economics has spent its time on. And I think that aspect of thinking in development economics about like what resources that we can give out, the benefits that people are measuring are tiny relative to the benefits that we need. And so I think that in that sense, some of development economics has lost the thread. Now, what you're talking about is a different move, which is to say that what we need is state capacity to make any of these things possible. I think that's entirely right. And for instance, one thing that you'll often hear from people that work, for instance, my work in India, people will say that what happens is extremely bright, educated Indians will go off to the University of Chicago and to Harvard, and they'll learn about all of the great programs that exist in the United States, and they'll come back and say, we need this too. And then when you try to implement it, realize that state capacity is just far too low to pull it off, right? There just aren't enough people that work in government, aren't enough resources, aren't enough money, aren't enough technical knowledge, capacity, et cetera, for these, some of these programs, right? And the answer then is until you can get the tax base up, until you can get the government institutions right, until you can improve public resources like education and healthcare, that these other things won't materialize either, right? So you need to, for instance, improve human capital before you can start leveraging it for higher economic growth. So I do agree that's an important caveat. Yeah.
In terms of the randomized control trials, it feels like a lot of their presence is addressing the issue you raised of getting these details right. Getting these details right can be so difficult, especially with our perspective coming to these countries. how do we start trying to solve those problems without some of those randomized control trials?
Yeah, so our colleague at the Harris School, Chris Blattman, who runs, for instance, the development workshop here and is a leading figure in this area, he's been recently, over the last year or two, doing a book tour on this book that he wrote, Why We Fight. And he's been pressed on, he's spent a lot of his career doing randomized control experiments, and they've been getting under fire for the things that I've been talking about, that they don't make much of an impact, they're tough to scale, they're really expensive to run, et cetera. And what he said is that he's changed his thinking about the value of experiments. That he used to think the reason that we go do big experiments in Kenya is to learn how to improve Kenya. The real reason to run randomized control experiments, he now thinks, is so that graduate students from the United States have to spend time in Kenya before they start talking about it. And so that's what I think is that we can learn about what works in India by going there and randomizing which village gets a well, or you can spend more time there before you try to start offering perspectives on it. And so I don't think that the only way that we can figure out what works is by just the pure randomization, because I think the things that we really care about, the big levers, no one's willing to randomize, right? So we can randomize distributing like relatively cheap resources, but not hugely expensive legal systems or inputs.
So the point about investment in education and health, you have looked at a large number of countries in these database, and there are countries which have broken their trend line growth and have taken off, like Chile in the 80s, China, or even Japan in the 50s. Was there a period before that there was an increased investment in growth in education and health, or was it just markets? Can we find a country where increased investment in health and education led to that breakout?
Yeah, no, so I think this is probably an intentionally leading question, and that I think that when you look at the countries that have had the massive change in their trajectory, what typically happens is there's what's often called a development bargain, which is the elite of the country, whether or not that's the leading politicians or business leaders or social leaders, whatever it is, deciding that they're actually willing to make the reforms necessary to liberalize markets and not to steal all of the surplus, right? Now, how you get to make that deal is what's complicated, and we're bad at figuring out. But what seems important is making the deal, not necessarily 20 years of building schools first, right? And so you see the change in growth pretty fast after the liberalization happens, whereas if the mechanism was entirely through education or health, there would be a long lag, right? So it's not as if like China liberalizes in the late 70s and they have to wait 15 years until people have made it through high school under some educational reform. The growth happens, same in India in 91 or whatever, relatively shortly after that.
And how do you understand the connection between common law efficiency, torts, contracts, and property, and growth? It seemed to be you were applying those two things. I didn't quite see you make that connection. Is there a connection there, or do we know what the data says on that?
Yeah. So here's what I don't know is of any single study that has said like, here is a change in a legal rule that went from a suboptimal common law doctrine to an optimal common law doctrine, and like here's a change in GDP per capita growth, right? What I think, though, what I'm trying to say is the broad version of the insight that if you focus on efficiency and have that as a principle that you're maximizing, while thinking about legal, economic, and political problems, can steer you in the right direction, right? And so what I'm not trying to claim is that like once countries figure out like the optimal rules around negligence standards, then this growth will follow. What I'm trying to say is like the insight that like sacrifice concerns about efficiency at your own peril is the lesson I'm trying to emphasize or to draw from this. Yeah.
Just going back to urbanization and the migration idea, just wondering how robust that is to like self-selection of migrants. That the people who immigrate tend to be the ones who are more motivated, or maybe they're more naturally likely to succeed. And also the fact that the migrants who stay are the ones who've succeeded. Like if you haven't succeeded, you've gone back to your country. So how robust is that finding?
Right. So I think that we are, the question of how you can account for selection when studying this, I think, is difficult. And every paper that studies this tries to have some answer why they have some exogenous shock that allows them to try to produce an estimate that's independent of self-selection. Whether or not you believe any individual estimate probably know, but as a good Bayesian, you see enough studies where people try to account for this different ways, update generally in that direction. My view on this is, though, to say, which is, it is probably the case that at some point you're going to hit an equilibrium before everyone's in a city where there wouldn't be any benefits to moving to cities. We're just nowhere near that point, right? And so is a general growth strategy of figuring out how we get people from rural India or China into cities where they can be more productive. It may be the case that there's at some point that stops being a productivity gain. I just don't think we're there in the developing world. Yeah, Audrey.
I'm pretty loud. So I had a similar thought, which is, it seems like you kind of buried the lead here, because instead of this being law economics and international development, shouldn't the title be law economics and international migration? Because if we can get 150% increase in global GDP just by opening up migration, that would lift a ton of people out of poverty almost instantly, and it would solve so much of our problems. So why isn't mucking around with, the stuff in the slums kind of the same as losing the forest for the trees as the folks, building the trees in Pakistan? Like, shouldn't we all just be lobbying Congress to open the floodgates to migration?
Oh yeah. So first off, strong agree. Yes. So in my own research, Dean Miles talks about some of the topics, so I bounce through constitutions and treaties and all of these things. And what the last few years spent the most time on is collecting and building data on migration, because just these other things you find negative advantages from or small advantages in the migration just blows you away in any study. You just think we cannot get close to this with any other strategy. Now, I'll end on this note, which is one thing that has been disheartening over the last 2 years is that in the United States we have a major problem of lack of labor supply, and we could reduce inflation and grow our economy immediately if we made it easier for people to move to the United States right now. And despite the fact that that is obvious to anyone that's paying attention, there seems to be no political discussion on it and no political will. In other words, we have a moment where we've got a clear problem where migration could make the problem easier for so many people, and instead of making it easier, we're just not solving our visa issues. And there's been essentially no difference between Biden and Trump on these issues, right? Some small issues, but in general, the change in administration did not make the United States reverse course on this thing. And so this is somewhere where we're moving essentially in the wrong direction. And I agree, it's the answer to these problems. And it's going to be even more the answer going forward when, one, you have displacement due to climate change, changing the temperature in different regions, and two, the demographic time bomb that exists in developing societies where we are not at replacement level population in the United States and Europe and Japan. We're going to have more immigration. And as of now, we're not willing to entertain that despite the importance of the problem. All right, thanks everybody.